I think that players sometimes misrepresent how complicated certain cards are, because one thing that I hear a lot is that if a card has a lot of text, if it has many sentences, it is therefore complicated, and I feel like in a lot of examples that doesn't actually work. Something like Blacklisted Soldier Envoy of the Beginning has a lot of text on it, but it's not too hard to grasp. Even things like Astrograph Sorcerer, which I think is the go-to long text that people make fun of, I don't think it's that hard to understand it. It just takes a while to read. However, there is one card out there, more people ask questions about it than any other card I've ever played in my entire life, and especially when I live stream, people are always asking how it works, and that card is, as the title would suggest, none other than Inspector Border. And there are a lot of questions about this card. There's a lot of rulings about this card that you should know, especially if decks like Guru Control and Ultrageist and even True Dracos are going to be popular this upcoming format. All of those decks likely are going to be playing Inspector Border, at least in their side decks, so you should definitely know how the card works. In today's video, we're going to read through the entire effect of Inspector Border and then sort of break it down piece by piece to analyze all the different rulings and restrictions with all of its effects. So the first line says, cannot be normal or special summon if you control a monster. Neither player can activate monster effects unless the number of monster effects that player has previously activated that turn is less than the number of monster card types currently on the field. And then in parentheses it says Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Exceeds, Pendulum, and Link. That's a pretty long second sentence there. And then it has a long piece in parentheses that says if an effect's activation was negated, it still counts toward that total for that turn. Only count effects that were activated while this monster was face up on the field. Oh my gosh, that is so much text in parentheses. Actually, I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that is the longest amount of text that is on a Yu-Gi-Oh card in parentheses. Like half this card is sort of not in the main sentences, but there's a lot to unpack here. So we're going to do this step by step so you guys can fully understand how this card operates. So first off, this card cannot be normal or special summon if you control a monster, and admittedly I don't think this is the area where most players get confused. However, it is worth pointing out that even with this line of text, you are in fact allowed to set this card in face down defense position even if you control another monster, and in fact that is very important because if you're playing multiple copies of this card and you already have one face up on the field, if you want to actually get the extra copies out of your hand, you'll want to set them. Please note this card also can be flip summoned even if you control monsters. So in that sort of example I just gave, you'll summon Inspector Border turn 1, and turn 2 you'll set another copy, turn 3 you'll flip summon that copy. Now you have two of them on the field. It doesn't really come up too often, but if you are playing multiple copies, you probably want to know how to summon the other ones. It'll take a while because you can't just directly normal summon it, but eventually you can get them face up on the field. And that brings us to the second sentence, which is pretty long, and I think we'll have to divide this in a couple smaller sections, but it says neither player can activate monster effects unless the number of monster effects that player has previously activated that turn is less than the number of monster card types currently on the field. So what does this mean? Well, first off, keep in mind this card is not like Skill Drain, it is more like Majesty's Fiend. And what's the difference there? Well, the difference there is that with a card like Inspector Border, your opponent cannot even attempt to use monster effects while this card is on the field and they are locked down with its effect. Unlike something like Skill Drain, where your opponent can still attempt to use them, which means that they can discard for costs or whatever they do. That's a pretty big difference because this means that if your opponent wants to do something as a cost for a monster effect, they're not allowed to unless the card permits. That's a pretty big deal, but just keep that in mind. You are not allowed to attempt to use effects if this card is locking you down. That is just like Majesty's Fiend. So all of the Majesty's Fiend rulings as far as that goes do apply to Inspector Border. Now I think the other part that a lot of people get confused on is the second half of that, which says that unless the number of monster effects that player has previously activated that turn is less than the number of monster card types currently on the field. What the heck does that mean? Well, basically the simplest way of explaining it is just going one by one and talking about the scenarios where you have Inspector Border on the field. For example, if you just have an Inspector Border on the field and there are no other monsters or only effect in normal monsters on the board, your opponent and yourself can't use any monster effects, period. That's just the end of the story there. As far as getting extra monsters on the field, this means if you have Inspector Border and your opponent summons a monster and turns it into a Link monster, now as long as that one Link monster is on the field and neither you nor your opponent have activated a monster effect previously in that turn, your opponent and you can both activate one monster effect. Keep in mind here, if they add another card type to the field at the same time that the Link monster is also still on the field, that number of effects goes up to 2 per each player. So what this means is that let's say you go second, right? And your opponent has a Mirage Delio and you summon Inspector Boarder. Well, if your opponent goes and they have that Mirage Delio, they have an Xyz monster so they can detach to special summon a monster from the deck. However, keep in mind, if they then turn that Mirage Delio and the card they summoned into a Link monster, they don't get another effect, because currently at that moment, even though they used a monster effect while there was an Xyz monster on the board, now there's a Link monster, the total number of card types on the field is still 1. And when we read through Inspector Boarder's effect, it says that neither player can activate monster effects unless the number of monster effects that player has previously activated that turn. So the only way to get extra effects while Inspector Boarder is on the field, instead of just 1, is controlling multiple different monsters of these card types that it's listing. I would say in many cases, it's just going to be Links and Xyz monsters. I mean, we certainly see Synchros, Pendulums, and Fusions, Rituals every once in a while, but in general, I would say most decks are just going to have Link monsters or maybe some Xyz monsters in their extra decks, so you don't really have to worry about your opponent using more than 2 effects per turn. And then the last 2 sentences of this card text, which are both in parentheses, are sort of just additions that are very important to note when you're playing against or with Inspector Boarder. It says, if an effect's activation was negated, it still counts towards the total for that turn. Only count effects that were activated while a monster was face on the field. So the first half of that means that if your opponent summons a Link monster and then they activate a monster effect and you have the border on the field, if you use something like Solemn Strike, that activation still counts towards the Inspector Boarder's blanket effect. That means that even though the effect was negated, even though the activation itself was negated, you cannot use another effect, or your opponent can't use another effect unless they manage to get another extra deck monster or Pendulum monster on the field, or Ritual monster, I suppose sort of counts. But in general, with Inspector Boarder, you have to keep in mind that if your opponent is only going to have one of those mentioned card types, they only get that one effect. They only get one shot at it, even if you negate the effect. This is different from something like Six Samurai Shien and Great Shogun Shien. If you have both those on the field, if you negate something with the legendary Six Samurai Shien, it actually doesn't count towards the one spell or trap that your opponent is allowed to activate. A lot of people get that messed up. I saw when I was playing Six Samurai on Duel Links, so many people said, oh, it's a lockdown, your opponent just can't activate spells and traps. That's not how that interaction works, but it is how Inspector Boarder works, as well as cards like Summon Limit, which counts summons even if they're negated. And this isn't a video on Summon Limit, but I also should mention that with Summon Limit, it only counts negated summons that are inherent summons. If you negate a monster effect or a spell and trap effect that would special summon, those do not actually count. This is not a video on Summon Limit, but it is worth mentioning. I'll even throw up the card artwork on here so you guys can read the full effect. And then that very last sentence in that parentheses says, only count effects that were activated while this monster was face up on the field. That is a pretty big deal, and it's also a pretty big departure from Summon Limit. And yes, this isn't a Summon Limit video, but basically Summon Limit, if your opponent summons twice and you flip the card up, it counts those 2 previous summons. It even is written on the card like that, so that is a pretty big deal. But in the case of something like Inspector Boarder, if your opponent activates multiple effects before you get a chance to summon this thing, that doesn't actually count towards their 1 or 2 that you are allowed to do when Inspector Boarder eventually hits the field. For example, let's say your opponent starts their turn, or ends their turn I should say, with like a Hexia on board and a Multi-Faker in hand. You have an Inspector Boarder in your hand, so you draw for turn, and in your standby phase they activate Multi-Faker, summon a guy from deck. Now they've activated 2 effects and they have a Link monster on the field. If you summon Inspector Boarder, even though they've used 2 monster effects already, they still have 1 monster effect they can use because they still control that Altergeist Hexia. This is a pretty big deal, and while it might not come up in every matchup, it is just important to note that Inspector Boarder is not like Summon Limit in that it retroactively sort of reacts to what your opponent did previously in the turn. It only reacts to what it actually sees, and if your opponent has activated multiple effects already, it doesn't count those for its own restriction. So that is a lot to unpack in one video. This card's effect is very, very complicated, but let's talk about the practical application to realize that it's not that crazy, like once you actually get down to it. So in a lot of cases, when you go first, you'll just summon Inspector Boarder, and your opponent goes, and now they don't have any monster effects they can activate it, because if all you summon was Inspector Boarder and there's no other cards on the field, there's no monster effects that your opponent is allowed to do. There's no rituals on board, there's no Xyz on board, there's no links on board. So in a lot of cases, as someone that has played Inspector Boarder a lot, because it's commonly found in Altergeist side decks, when you have the Inspector Boarder on the field, it's just a normal summonable level 4 Majesty's Fiend, and that's pretty darn good. So what usually happens is your opponent can get like a couple monsters on the field without actually using monster effects. Something like Salamangreats, they can just normal summon a guy and make a Baling. Lynx and special summon a guy or something along those lines. And in those cases, what usually happens is they consolidate a couple monsters into a Link monster, and now both of you are allowed to use one monster effect. What's exceptionally good about this though is that when your opponent uses that one monster effect, if you're playing a trap-based strategy like Guru Control, like Altergeist, like True Dracos, oftentimes you can just use a Solemn Strike or something like Lost Wind or Altergeist Protocol or anything really. I mean, Subterra Phoenix even works if your opponent has that one Link monster, and now your opponent has wasted their one monster effect. So in a lot of cases, they just have to pass turn at that point, and that means that you just basically blanked their entire turn, and now you get a chance to get more setup, draw some more trap cards, and that's usually how it goes. So in a lot of cases, the border really is just a normal summonable Majesty's Fiend that you don't have to tribute for, and that's pretty darn good. Where the card obviously suffers, however, is going second. You probably won't want to side this card against most strategies going second, because if your opponent is playing something like Thunder Dragons, right, they might end their turn with a Synchro and a Link monster and a Seize monster and a Fusion monster, so they can already do 4 different effects. Just normal summoning Inspector Border when they already have those many different card types on the field means that it doesn't really do anything. It's just a vanilla monster at that point. So you usually want to save Inspector Border for when you're going first, so you can actually prevent your opponent from making any sort of board. Also keep in mind that Inspector Border does not stop inherent special summons, so one of the most common outs to this card is Dino Wrestler Prankatops, and it is worth mentioning though, if your opponent does that, you can do something like Crackdown or Lost Wind or Solemn Strike to prevent it from just running your monster over in battle. But that is definitely a card you really want to have a sort of backup plan for, because that is one of the most commonly played outs to Inspector Border. I know at first glance, and maybe even second and third glance, Inspector Border can look like a very complex card, and it is, but in a lot of ways it's really not, and hopefully this video helped you guys realize and understand how this card really works. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching today's discussion / ruling video on Inspector Border. Goodbye.